You're a widow now, Mom. It's time someone else started making decisions for you. Those were the words my daughter-in-law said less than an hour after the memorial service for my husband of 42 years. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at her, then at my son, and realized that grief was not going to be the hardest thing I faced that day. My name is Margaret Dawson. I'm 71 years old, and 3 months ago, I lost my husband, Harold. The memorial service had been held at a small church just outside Columbus, Ohio. Harold loved simple things. He never wanted grand gestures. Just family, friends, and honest memories. The sanctuary had been filled with people who respected him. Former coworkers, neighbors, men he had played golf with for 20 years. Women from the community garden where he spent every Saturday morning. Everyone seemed eager to tell me what a good man he had been. As if I didn't already know. By the time the service ended, I felt emotionally exhausted. Smiling at people. Accepting condolences. Listening to stories I had heard before. All of it felt like walking through fog. I just wanted to go home. Harold's truck was still parked in the garage. His coffee mug was still sitting beside the sink. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Those little reminders hurt, but they also comforted me. They reminded me that what we had built together had been real. Outside the church, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. I reached into my purse for my car keys. Before my fingers touched them, Jessica stepped in front of me. "I'll take those," she said. At first, I thought she meant to help me carry something. Then she extended her hand. "The keys, Margaret." I stared at her. "Why?" Her expression was calm. Too calm. "Because you shouldn't be driving right now." I blinked. "I drove here." That was different. "How?" She exchanged a glance with Brian. My own son. He looked away. "Mom," he finally said, "Jessica and I have been talking. We think it might be better if one of us handled things for a while." Handled things. Such a harmless phrase. Yet, something about it made my stomach tighten. "What things?" I asked. "Appointments. Bills. Driving. The house." Jessica folded her arms. "You've been through a lot." "I buried my husband," I replied quietly. I didn't lose my mind. Neither of them laughed. Neither of them smiled. Around us, people continued walking toward their cars. Nobody noticed the conversation taking place 10 feet away. Nobody noticed that a woman who had just lost her husband was being treated like a child. "We're only trying to help," Jessica said. I nodded slowly. That was the first time I heard those words. They would become her favorite phrase over the next several weeks. We're only trying to help. Every decision, every suggestion, every intrusion arrived wrapped inside those same 5 words. I looked at Brian, the little boy who once held my hand crossing parking lots. The little boy who cried when he scraped his knee. The little boy Harold and I had worked so hard to raise. He still couldn't meet my eyes. And somehow, that hurt more than anything Jessica had said. I handed nobody my keys that day. I drove home alone. But as I pulled into my driveway and looked at the house Harold and I had spent 30 years paying for, I noticed something I had missed before. This wasn't about concern. It wasn't about grief. It wasn't even about helping. Somewhere along the way, my son and his wife had started believing that my life belonged to them. And standing in my driveway, with the engine still running and Harold's empty seat beside me, I realized they had already begun making plans. The only question was how much they thought they could take before I finally noticed. The house felt different in ways that were difficult to explain. Not because anything had physically changed, but because Harold was no longer there to fill the spaces between the walls. Every morning, I still woke up at 6:30. For 42 years, that had been our routine. Harold would shuffle into the kitchen wearing his old gray robe while I made coffee. He always claimed he could make it himself, but somehow I always ended up pouring the first cup. Now the kitchen stayed quiet. The second mug remained in the cabinet. The chair across from mine sat empty. At first, I kept expecting to hear his footsteps. Then I stopped expecting it. That was somehow worse. 3 days after the memorial service, Brian stopped by unannounced. He used to call first. Harold had taught him that. Respect other people's time, even family. But lately, Brian seemed to believe the rules no longer applied to me. I heard his truck pull into the driveway just after lunch. By the time I opened the front door, he was already halfway up the porch steps. "I thought I would check in on you," he said. "That is thoughtful," I replied. His eyes moved past me and into the house. "Everything okay in there?" The question sounded normal. Yet something about the way he asked it made me pause. "Everything is fine." He nodded but continued looking around as though conducting an inspection. We sat in the living room. Harold's favorite recliner remained untouched beside the fireplace. Brian stared at it for a long moment. "Have you thought about downsizing?" he asked. I almost laughed. Harold had been gone less than 3 months. "No, the house is pretty large. It was large last year, too." Brian shifted in his seat. "I am just thinking long term." Long term. Another harmless phrase. Another phrase that suddenly seemed to appear in every conversation. I changed the subject. He changed it back. By the time he left, I felt exhausted. Not because of grief this time. Because I felt studied. Evaluated. Measured. The following week, Jessica called. Her voice carried the same careful sweetness she always used when she wanted something. "Margaret, I was wondering if you could send me a copy of your medication list." I frowned. "Why?" "Just in case of emergencies. My doctor already has that information." There was a brief silence. "Of course. I was only trying to help." There were those words again. A few days later, I discovered my dentist appointment had been rescheduled. I had not changed it. The receptionist informed me someone claiming to be a family member had called on my behalf. When I asked who, she apologized and said she could not remember. Then came the grocery store. I ran into a neighbor named Susan. We had known each other for almost 20 years. During our conversation, she smiled sympathetically and asked whether I was adjusting to having Brian help manage things. I stared at her. "What things?" Her smile faded. "Oh, I probably misunderstood." She quickly changed the subject. "But I noticed everything. Small comments. Strange questions. Tiny assumptions people suddenly seemed to make about my life." When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room Harold and I had shared for decades. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows exactly as it always had. Nothing looked different. Yet something was changing beneath the surface. Slowly. Quietly. Like a crack spreading through glass. I thought about the memorial service. The car keys. The conversations afterward. The constant suggestions. The sudden interest in my appointments, my schedule, my house. Individually, each incident seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether Brian and Jessica were preparing for something much bigger than either of them had admitted. 2 days later, I found the first piece of evidence that something was happening behind my back. It was not a dramatic discovery. There were no secret documents left on a table or mysterious phone calls in the middle of the night. It was a simple mistake. Jessica had sent an email to the wrong address. I was sitting at my kitchen table paying monthly bills when a notification appeared on my laptop. At first, I almost ignored it. The sender was Jessica. The subject line read, "Mom's schedule." That alone seemed odd. I opened it. The message itself was brief. Attached was a spreadsheet. My spreadsheet, apparently. Doctor appointments. Prescription refill dates. Banking appointments. Property tax reminders. Even my weekly grocery trips were listed. I stared at the screen for several seconds before opening the attachment. The details were accurate. Disturbingly accurate. Some entries included notes. Consider discussing transportation alternatives. Monitor spending habits. Evaluate long-term housing options. Housing options. I read those words 3 times. My hands remained perfectly still on the table. For years, I had handled every bill in this house. Harold trusted me completely. We made decisions together, but I managed the day-to-day finances. Suddenly seeing my own life reduced to a list of observations felt deeply unsettling. I scrolled farther. Near the bottom, another note caught my attention. Need updated assessment before proceeding. Proceeding with what? The document did not explain. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was Brian. I almost mentioned the email immediately. Instead, I listened. Just checking on you, Mom. His voice sounded casual. Too casual. That is kind of you. Everything going okay? Fine. There was a pause. You have not made any major financial decisions recently, have you? My eyes moved back to the spreadsheet. What kind of financial decisions? Nothing specific. I was just curious. Curious. Another harmless word that suddenly felt dangerous. We ended the call a few minutes later. Afterward, I walked through the house slowly. The living room. The dining room. The hallway Harold had painted himself one summer when we were both younger and foolish enough to think ladders were fun. Every room carried memories. Every room represented choices Harold and I had made together. Yet according to whatever plan Brian and Jessica were creating, those choices no longer seemed to matter. The following afternoon, I stopped at the bank to deposit a check. The branch manager, a man named Robert whom I had known for nearly 15 years, greeted me warmly. During our conversation, he casually mentioned receiving an inquiry about adding authorized access to one of my accounts. My stomach tightened. From whom? I asked. Robert looked surprised. I assumed you knew. He quickly apologized and explained that no changes had been made because proper authorization had not been provided. I thanked him and completed my business as though nothing were wrong. Inside, however, a puzzle was beginning to assemble itself. The spreadsheet. The questions about my finances. The appointment changes. The comments from neighbors. The inquiry at the bank. Each piece connected to the next. That evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the trees behind the property. Harold used to sit beside me there every summer evening. We would talk about simple things. Weather. Family. Travel plans we never quite got around to taking. As darkness settled across the yard, I realized something important. Until now, I had been reacting. Watching. Trying to understand. That was about to change. Because for the first time, I was no longer asking whether Brian and Jessica were planning something. I was beginning to ask how far they were willing to go. And deep down, I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. The next morning, I decided to stop guessing and start looking. Harold had never been a suspicious man, but he believed in being prepared. Throughout our marriage, he kept records of everything. Insurance policies, property documents, tax returns, investment statements. If something important existed, Harold had filed it somewhere. After breakfast, I walked upstairs to his old study. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. For weeks after his passing, I had avoided spending too much time there. The sight of his empty desk hurt more than I wanted to admit. That day was different. I was not there to grieve. I was there to understand. The filing cabinets stood exactly where they had always been. I opened the first drawer and began sorting through folders. Most contained ordinary documents, utility records, home maintenance receipts, old vehicle registrations. Hours passed quietly. Sunlight moved across the carpet. Dust floated through the air. Then I found a folder I did not recognize. It was labeled simply, Family. Inside were several documents and a sealed envelope with my name written in Harold's handwriting. My hands froze. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I carefully opened the envelope. The letter was dated nearly 2 years earlier. Harold's words felt as familiar as his voice. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, circumstances had probably changed in ways neither of us wanted. He reminded me that he trusted my judgment completely. Then came a paragraph that made my heart stop. Harold explained that during a conversation with Brian, concerns had been raised about future control of family assets. Harold did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. That was never his style. Instead, he described subtle comments, suggestions, questions about ownership, discussions about what might happen when we became older. According to the letter, those conversations had troubled him enough to make several legal changes. I continued reading. Harold had met privately with an attorney. Certain protections had been added to our estate plan. Specific instructions had been placed on file. Most importantly, no transfer of authority over finances, property, or personal decisions could occur without strict legal requirements being met. I sat motionless for several minutes. Suddenly, many recent events looked different. Harold had seen something years ago. Not enough to create conflict. Not enough to damage the family. But enough to prepare for the possibility that boundaries might someday be tested. As I carefully returned the letter to its envelope, I noticed another business card clipped to the inside of the folder. The name belonged to an attorney in Columbus named Daniel Mercer. Harold had written a short note beside it. "If you ever feel pressured, call him first." I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. Later that afternoon, Brian called again. His timing felt almost eerie. We exchanged small talk before he casually mentioned that Jessica had been researching senior living communities. I remained silent. He continued speaking. The communities were beautiful, he said. Safe. Convenient. Many residents loved them. I looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard Harold and I had spent decades maintaining together. The maple tree we planted when Brian was 10 stood tall near the fence line. Every inch of this property carried history. Every corner represented years of work and sacrifice. "I am not planning to move," I said quietly. There was a pause on the line. Longer than usual. "Nobody is saying you have to," Brian replied. Yet something in his voice suggested otherwise. After the call ended, I sat alone at the kitchen table once again. Only now, the uncertainty that had followed me for weeks was beginning to fade. In its place came something else. Clarity. Harold had left me more than memories. He had left me a warning. And for the first time, I began to suspect that whatever Brian and Jessica were planning, they had no idea that Harold had already anticipated it years before. The following morning, I called Daniel Mercer. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, yet it changed everything. He remembered Harold immediately. His voice softened when he spoke about him. After confirming who I was, he invited me to his office later that week. I arrived on Thursday carrying the folder I had found in Harold's study. Daniel reviewed the documents carefully. He read the letter twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your husband was a thoughtful man," he said. "He wanted to make certain that no one could pressure you into surrendering control over your finances or property." Hearing those words out loud brought an unexpected sense of relief. For weeks, I had questioned my own instincts. I had wondered whether grief was making me overly sensitive, whether I was imagining connections that did not exist. Daniel's reaction confirmed otherwise. He explained that Harold had updated several legal documents over the years. Trust provisions, financial safeguards, medical directives. Everything had been designed to protect my independence. More importantly, Daniel assured me that no one could simply decide I needed help managing my affairs. Legal standards existed for a reason. Evidence was required. Proper evaluations were required. Procedures had to be followed. As he spoke, I remembered the spreadsheet, the notes, the inquiries, the constant questions. Suddenly, they seemed less random and more deliberate. Before leaving, I asked a question that had been weighing on me. If someone wanted control over another person's finances, where would they begin? Daniel studied me for a moment before answering. Usually by creating a narrative. They try to convince others that help is necessary. Then they look for evidence that supports the story they are telling. A narrative. The word followed me all the way home. That evening, I began paying closer attention than ever before. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. On Saturday, Brian and Jessica invited me to dinner. I accepted. Their home sat in a newer subdivision about 20 miles away. Everything looked carefully maintained. Fresh landscaping. Bright exterior paint. The kind of neighborhood where every lawn seemed trimmed to exactly the same height. During dinner, the conversation remained pleasant at first. Work, weather, community events. Then Jessica mentioned a woman from her church whose elderly mother had recently moved into assisted living. "She is so much happier now," Jessica said. "Less stress, more support." Brian nodded. Sometimes people do not realize how much help they need. I took a sip of water. Perhaps. Jessica smiled. The transition can be difficult at first, but eventually most people understand it is for the best. There it was again. Not a direct statement. Not an accusation. Just another carefully planted idea. Another small piece of the narrative Daniel had described. For the rest of the evening, I listened more than I spoke. The more I listened, the more patterns emerged. Jessica seemed unusually interested in my schedule. Brian asked questions about household maintenance expenses. They discussed future planning repeatedly. None of it sounded alarming on its own. Together, however, it formed a picture I could no longer ignore. As I prepared to leave, Jessica walked me to the front door. "We only want what is best for you, Margaret," she said warmly. I smiled politely. I know. It was the answer she expected. But as I drove home beneath the glow of the streetlights, another realization settled into place. They believed they were slowly guiding me toward a conclusion. They believed I would eventually accept the version of reality they were constructing around me. What they did not know was that I had already stepped outside their story. And once I understood the game being played, I intended to learn every rule before making my next move. Over the next 2 weeks, I changed my routine without telling anyone. Not because I was hiding, but because I was observing. Every conversation became a source of information. Every question revealed something. Every unexpected suggestion told me a little more about what Brian and Jessica were thinking. I began keeping notes, dates, comments, incidents that seemed insignificant on their own. The notebook remained in the kitchen drawer beside the takeout menus and spare batteries. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. One Tuesday morning, I received a call from my primary care physician's office. The receptionist sounded confused. She explained that someone had contacted the office requesting information about cognitive screening services. My heart remained calm. "Who made the inquiry?" I asked. Privacy rules prevented her from providing details, but she confirmed it had come from a family member. After hanging up, I sat quietly for several minutes. Daniel's words returned immediately. Create a narrative. Gather evidence to support the narrative. Suddenly, the pieces fit together even more clearly. A few days later, I attended a luncheon hosted by the Community Garden Association. Harold and I had been members for years. While speaking with an old friend named Carol, she mentioned running into Jessica at a grocery store the previous week. "She seemed worried about you," Carol said gently. "She said you have been forgetting things lately." I smiled politely. Inside, however, something shifted. Forgetting things. Another small brick added to the wall they were building. Another story being quietly shared. Another version of me being introduced to people without my knowledge. That evening, I reviewed my notes again. The list had grown longer than I expected. The spreadsheet. The appointment changes. The bank inquiry. The housing conversations. The comments to neighbors. The questions about cognitive evaluations. Viewed together, they no longer looked like concern. They looked coordinated. Yet the most surprising realization involved Brian. I kept searching for signs of malice and could not quite find them. Jessica was usually the one guiding conversations. Jessica asked the leading questions. Jessica introduced the ideas. Brian often seemed uncomfortable. Not innocent, but uncertain. That distinction mattered. One Saturday afternoon, he stopped by the house carrying a toolbox. A loose railing on the back deck needed repair. For several hours, we worked together quietly. The atmosphere felt almost normal. For a brief moment, I saw glimpses of the sun I remembered. We drank iced tea afterward and watched the wind move through the maple tree. Then he said something unexpected. "Jessica worries about you a lot." I nodded. "I know." He looked down at his glass. "She just wants to make sure everything is okay." The hesitation in his voice caught my attention. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. For the first time, I wondered whether Brian was leading this effort or simply following it. Before leaving, he hugged me. The gesture felt sincere. Yet sincerity did not erase consequences. After he drove away, I sat alone on the porch until sunset. The air had begun turning cooler. Autumn was approaching. Harold always loved this time of year. As darkness settled across the yard, I opened my notebook again and added one final observation. They still believed I knew very little. They still believed their conversations were shaping the future. They still believed they were several steps ahead. What they did not realize was that every move they made was becoming part of a much larger record. And if they eventually decided to push harder, they would discover that I had spent weeks preparing long before they ever realized I was paying attention. The moment I had been expecting arrived on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Jessica called and asked whether I could meet with her and Brian the following evening. Her tone sounded cheerful, but there was an unusual firmness underneath it. "We just want to discuss a few future plans," she said. Future plans. By then, I had learned to pay attention whenever those words appeared. I agreed without hesitation. The next evening, I drove to their house and arrived exactly on time. Jessica greeted me warmly at the door. Brian seemed nervous. We sat around the dining room table while Jessica brought coffee and a plate of cookies. For several minutes, the conversation stayed comfortably superficial. Then Jessica placed a folder on the table. My eyes moved to it immediately. Brian looked down. Jessica smiled. "We have been doing some research," she began. "Research about what?" I asked. "About making sure you have support as you move into this next stage of life." I remained silent. She opened the folder and removed several brochures. Retirement communities. Assisted living facilities. Senior lifestyle developments. The same themes that had been appearing for weeks now sat neatly organized in front of me. Jessica slid one brochure across the table. "This place is beautiful. Private cottages. On-site medical services. Social activities. Everything is designed to make life easier." I glanced at the glossy photographs and set the brochure aside. "I am happy where I live." Jessica's smile tightened slightly. "Of course. We understand that. We are just trying to think ahead." Brian finally spoke. "Mom, nobody is forcing anything." The fact that he felt the need to say it told me more than he realized. Nobody says those words unless force has already entered the conversation. Jessica continued describing amenities and programs. I listened patiently. Occasionally I nodded. Occasionally I asked a question. The entire time I noticed something interesting. Neither of them asked what I wanted. They discussed what would be convenient, what would be safe, what would be practical. Yet my own preferences seemed almost irrelevant. Eventually Jessica reached the final page in her folder. "There is one more thing." Her voice softened. "We have also spoken with someone about helping organize your finances." There it was. Not hidden anymore. Not implied. Spoken openly. I looked directly at Brian. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Why?" I asked. Jessica answered before he could. "Managing a house, investments, bills, insurance policies. It is a lot for one person. I have managed them for years. You manage them with Harold." The room became very quiet. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I folded my hands calmly on the table. "And you believe I cannot manage them now?" Jessica immediately backtracked. "That is not what I said." But it was exactly what she meant. I left shortly afterward. The conversation remained polite from beginning to end. No arguments. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Yet as I drove home through the rain, I realized something important. The planning stage was ending. The suggestions were becoming proposals. The proposals would eventually become actions. Their confidence had grown because they believed their narrative was working. They believed I would eventually agree. They believed I was alone. What neither of them understood was that every conversation, every document, every carefully worded suggestion had already strengthened my position. And as I pulled into my driveway and saw the warm light shining through the kitchen window of the house Harold and I built together, I found myself thinking about something Daniel Mercer had said during our first meeting. The strongest defense is often preparation. By that point, I was prepared. The only thing left was discovering what move they planned to make next. 3 days later, the next move finally arrived. It came in the form of a certified letter delivered to my mailbox on a gray Monday morning. I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope while rain tapped softly against the windows. The return address belonged to a law office I had never seen before. My pulse remained steady as I opened it. Inside was a formal notice requesting my participation in a family planning consultation regarding future care, financial oversight, and personal decision support. The language sounded professional, respectful, helpful even. Yet every sentence carried the same underlying message. Someone was preparing a case that I required supervision. I read the document twice before setting it down beside my coffee cup. Then I called Daniel Mercer. He asked me to bring the letter to his office immediately. By noon, I was sitting across from him once again. He reviewed the document carefully and nodded as though he had been expecting something similar. "This is not a legal judgment," he explained. "It is an attempt to establish a record." I thought about all the conversations over the past several months. The comments, the suggestions, the concerns shared with neighbors and doctors. A record. That was exactly what they had been building. Daniel reached into a folder and placed several documents on his desk. They included updated financial statements, medical records, independent evaluations, and legal protections Harold had arranged years earlier. Everything demonstrated the same thing. I was healthy, competent, financially responsible, fully capable of managing my own affairs. Daniel smiled slightly. "The facts are on your side." For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not because the situation had improved, but because uncertainty was disappearing. Facts had a way of cutting through stories. That evening, Brian called. His voice sounded unusually cautious. "Did you receive a letter today?" I looked out the window toward the backyard. The maple tree had begun turning shades of gold and orange. Autumn had arrived. "Yes," I replied. A long silence followed. "Mom, we were only trying to start a conversation." "About what?" Another pause. "About making sure you have support." The answer sounded rehearsed. I imagined Jessica sitting nearby, listening, guiding, shaping. "I see," I said calmly. Brian cleared his throat. "Nobody is trying to take anything away from you." It was the second time he had felt compelled to make that statement. The second time he had volunteered a defense before I had even made an accusation. We ended the conversation politely. Afterward, I sat alone in the living room and looked at the framed photographs lining the mantel. Family vacations, graduation ceremonies, birthdays, decades of memories captured inside simple wooden frames. I wondered when concern had become control, when helping had become managing, when protecting had become deciding. The next morning, Daniel called with additional information. During his review, he had identified the attorney who prepared the consultation request. Apparently, Jessica had been involved in multiple meetings during the previous month. Not Brian. Jessica. The realization did not surprise me anymore. In many ways, it confirmed what I had suspected for weeks. The narrative had an architect. The strategy had direction. And now, for the first time, the effort had stepped into the open. As evening approached, I returned to Harold's study and sat quietly at his old desk. The room felt different than it had months earlier. Less painful. More reassuring. I opened the notebook that contained all my observations and slowly turned through the pages. Dates. Conversations. Documents. Patterns. Evidence. Everything was there. They believed they were preparing me for the future. In reality, they had prepared me for something else entirely. Because now that the truth stood clearly in front of me, there was no longer any reason to simply observe. The time for preparation was ending. And very soon, everyone involved would learn just how carefully Harold and I had prepared for this exact moment. The meeting took place 2 weeks later. Daniel had encouraged me to attend, not because I needed to prove anything, but because transparency often reveals more than confrontation ever could. The consultation was held in a conference room at a professional office building on the north side of Columbus. The room was clean, quiet, and completely ordinary. Yet the moment I walked inside, I could feel the tension. Jessica sat with a stack of folders in front of her. Brian sat beside her. He looked tired. Older somehow. Daniel took the seat next to me. Across the table sat a consultant and an attorney who had been invited to discuss future planning options. Everyone exchanged polite greetings. Coffee was offered. Small talk filled the first few minutes. Then the conversation began. Jessica spoke first. She described her concerns. My age. My recent loss. The responsibilities of maintaining a house alone. The importance of planning ahead. Everything sounded reasonable on the surface. That was what made it so effective. She never called me incapable. She never said I could not manage my affairs. Instead, she carefully stacked concern upon concern until a picture began to emerge. A picture of someone who might eventually need others to step in. When she finished, the consultant turned toward me. Mrs. Dawson, how do you feel about these concerns? I folded my hands and smiled. I appreciate that my family cares about me. Jessica visibly relaxed. For a moment, I think she believed the conversation was going exactly as planned. Then I continued. However, concern and control are not the same thing. The room became very still. Daniel opened a folder. One by one, he presented documents. Financial records showing years of responsible management. Medical evaluations confirming excellent cognitive health. Property records. Estate documents. Independent assessments. Every fact supported the same conclusion. I was fully capable of managing my own life. The consultant reviewed the materials carefully. Questions were asked. Answers were given. Facts replaced assumptions. The narrative that had been slowly constructed over months began to unravel in less than an hour. Jessica attempted to redirect the discussion several times, but each time the documents spoke more clearly than opinions ever could. Brian remained mostly silent. Eventually, he lowered his eyes and stared at the table. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen. Only sadness. Because none of this should have been necessary. Families should not need evidence to prove trust. Yet here we were. Near the end of the meeting, the consultant asked a final question. Mrs. Dawson, what would you like moving forward? I thought about Harold. The study. The letter. The maple tree in the backyard. 42 years of building a life together. Then I answered. I would like the same thing Harold and I always wanted. Respect for my ability to make my own decisions. Nobody argued with that. There was nothing left to argue. When the meeting ended, people gathered their papers quietly. Jessica avoided my eyes. Brian approached me near the door. For a moment, he looked like the little boy I used to walk to school. Mom, he said softly, I am sorry. I studied his face. Regret was finally there. Real regret. I know, I replied. Outside, the autumn air felt crisp and clean. Daniel shook my hand before heading toward his car. I stood alone for a moment beneath a sky filled with drifting clouds. My husband was gone. Nothing would ever change that. But losing Harold had not meant losing myself. It had not meant surrendering my judgment, my home, or my independence. The people who loved me should have known that from the beginning. As I drove home, the sun broke through the clouds and illuminated the road ahead. For the first time in many months, the future felt clear. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because the truth no longer needed defending. It simply existed. And so did I.